It's Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, where we provide tailor-made solutions for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies and otherwise medically complex patients by improving their quality of life, and where we also provide tailor-made solutions to hospitals and intensive care units, reducing the cost of an ICU bed by 50% whilst providing quality care. In last week's blog, I talked about 5 things you can do right now to get your loved one home and out of ICU or pediatric ICU if they are long-term ventilated or medically complex. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to shed light on the false economy and no quality of life, keeping long-term ventilated patients in ICU for longer than necessary. Let's dive right into it. An intensive care bed or pediatric intensive care bed is the most expensive bed in a hospital, period. It costs approximately $5,000 per bed day. On top of being the most expensive hospital bed, it's also the bed in a hospital that is the most sought after and therefore in high demand. Therefore, if ICU or PICU beds are not readily available for critically ill patients, it can have dramatic consequences for patients in need of such an in-demand ICU or pediatric ICU bed. The trend is clear. With intensive care units, emergency departments, as well as first responders such as paramedics or mobile intensive care units, attending to medical emergencies such as cardiac arrests, motor vehicle accidents, etc., and improving their success rates in saving lives in the short term and in the long term, it often results in those patients requiring long-term ventilation and tracheostomies. Moreover, more neonates surviving premature or complicated birth also often results in extended neonatal ICU and pediatric ICU stays. This puts significant upward pressure on ICU beds with the result of average length of stays going up, costs rising astronomically, and patients and their families having no quality of life because of their prolonged ICU stays. In order to understand the dilemma fully that ICUs and pediatric ICUs, long-term ventilated patients and families are in, we need to take a look at this situation from a few angles. First off, when patients are being induced into a coma for mechanical ventilation support with a breathing tube or an endotracheal tube to begin with, for respiratory failure due to the nature of their critical illness, many patients in that situation fail ventilation weaning to begin with, and they need a tracheostomy. After a tracheostomy has been performed, ventilation weaning should be easier because the need for sedation and the induced coma has been minimized. Depending on the nature of the critical illness, the length of an induced coma, the pre-medical history, and depending why a tracheostomy and ventilation was initiated in the first place, ventilation weaning and decannulation, which is the removal of the tracheostomy, is often prolonged, and multiple weaning attempts are needed to be successful. In many instances, ventilation and tracheostomy weaning is unsuccessful, and therefore an increasing number of adults and pediatric patients in intensive care remain on life support with ventilation and tracheostomy for an indefinite period of time. They are therefore stuck in intensive care with no quality of life, whilst blocking a precious and in-demand $5,000 per bed day ICU or pediatric ICU bed that could be used for other more acutely unwell patients in intensive care. Meanwhile, most long-term ventilated patients with tracheostomies in intensive care can go home with a specialized and accredited service like intensive care at home. Intensive care at home provides a win-win situation and stops the false economy of many intensive care units and hospitals. Funding $5,000 per bed day ICU and pediatric ICU beds, whilst the cost of the ICU and pediatric ICU bed can be slashed by at least 50% with intensive care at home services. This improves quality of life or quality of end of life for patients and their families, as we have shown with many of our clients. You can also have a look at our intensive care at home case studies, which includes case studies on non-invasive BiPAP and CPAP ventilation, as well as otherwise medically complex patients at risk of ICU or pediatric ICU admissions. Improving the quality of life or quality of end of life for long-term ICU or pediatric ICU patients at home as a genuine alternative to a long-term stay in ICU and pediatric ICU is what we do best. Families benefit from our service too. Rather than spending day and night in ICU or pediatric ICU, we bring normality to our clients because we enable our clients and their families to go back to work, look after other family members, and generally speaking, get on with their lives. This certainly isn't possible in ICU or pediatric ICU. Some of our pediatric clients in particular have the ability to go back to school and once again live a life on their terms rather than on the terms of an ICU or pediatric ICU. This creates a win-win situation for all stakeholders. The win for ICU, pediatric ICU and hospitals, as well as other funding bodies, is that the cost of an intensive care bed is being reduced by more than 50% of the $5,000 per bed day, going from ICU, pediatric ICU to intensive care at home. On top of this massive cost reduction, we are freeing up in-demand ICU and pediatric ICU beds that are then able to be used for more acutely unwell and more critically ill patients. That means surgical or medical waiting lists are not getting any longer because ICU and pediatric ICU beds are available and critically ill patients can get into ICU and pediatric ICU when needed. So if you want to find out how we can help you to get your loved one out of intensive care, including palliative care or long-term acute care or out of a nursing home, or if you are finding that you have insufficient support for your loved one at home on a ventilator, then please contact us at intensivecareathome.com on one of the numbers on the website, or simply send me an email to patrick@intensivecareathome.com. That's Patrick just with a K at the end. We can also help you to get funding for our service. Also, have a look at our career section. We are currently hiring ICU and pediatric ICU nurses for clients in the Melbourne metropolitan area and in South Gippsland, Victoria. We are an NDIS, TAC and Department of Veteran Affairs approved community service provider in Australia. Also have a look at our range of full service provisions on the website. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog. This is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, and I'll see you again next week in another update.